Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the final Toolkits fiction broadcast of 2020. It's happened so quickly. Before all else, I would like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you from stolen land. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, who are the traditional custodians of the land, both from which I'm broadcasting to you and from where my guest artist is speaking to you tonight also. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that the violence of the colonial project is ongoing. I don't know, I guess a quick one this week. I stand in solidarity with Black communities, both here and around the world. And while that's not a sort of new or revolutionary statement that I'm making, this moment feels like an especially pertinent time to say it, and then say it again, and say it louder. With that said, my name is Jennifer Down, if we haven't met before, and I have the very good fortune to facilitate the Toolkits fiction program with 8 amazing emerging writers. I'm going to be sorry to see them go next week. And I'm also fortunate to be joined tonight by writer and editor. It's been a long week. Writer and editor extraordinaire, Adalya Nash Hussein. Adalya, thank you so much for coming along and joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Adalya is a writer and editor, and her work has appeared, you might have seen it in VoiceWorks, you might have seen it in The Lifted Brow, you might have seen it in Ibis House, Meanjin, or Going Down Swinging. She has been an Emerging Writers Festival Melbourne Recital Centre Writer in Residence, a Wheeler Centre Hot Desk Fellow, which you should all apply for, emerging writers, if you haven't done. And she's also been shortlisted for the Scribe Non-Fiction Prize. She just recently started as the editor of VoiceWorks about a month ago, and it's also a co-editor of Liminal, which in, I don't know, my humble opinion, puts out some of the most beautiful and thought-provoking interviews going around in Australia at the moment. So this morning, oh my God, sorry, it's just going to be a really long night. Whew, this evening, I feel like it's morning. We will be talking about getting your work ready for publication, kind of making it the best that it can possibly be before you send it out into the world. Before we do that, a really quick refresher about the program in case this is the first time you're joining us. So Toolkits is a 12-week intensive course. It's for writers under 30 and it's facilitated by Express Media, who you might know as the publishers of VoiceWorks magazine. Maybe you know them through another Toolkits program. You might know them through their Tracks program. It's digitally based, which is important because it means that you can participate from anywhere in Australia as long as you have a Wi-Fi connection. And this year we've been really fortunate to have participants from all over Australia, which is good because it gets us outside of the big bad cities of Melbourne and Sydney. What else? This is actually, as I said, our last Toolkits fiction broadcast for the year, which is a bit sad. But there are a bunch of applications currently open for sort of, I don't know, second semester or second half of 2020 Toolkits programs. One of those is for the poetry program, which is this year facilitated by the amazing Elena Gomez. She actually edited my second book, and she is one of the best eggs in the business. I can vouch for her personally. You can also apply for the playwriting program, which is led by Jess Bellamy, digital storytelling with Rory Green, who is the digital editor of VoiceWorks magazine, or you can apply for graphic narratives with Mira Schlossberg. Any of those, all of them would be amazing. Applications close in a few weeks. I can't remember the exact date. I want to say the 22nd of June. Don't quote me on it. You've got a couple of weeks to apply, so make haste. And lastly, this evening, you are welcome and even encouraged to ask questions via Twitter using the hashtag #EMToolkits. That's hashtag capital E, capital M Toolkits. Adalya, thank you for bearing with me. Let's get into it. Can I start with a bit of a curly question, please?
Yeah, go for it.
Why do we need editors? Like, what's the point?
Okay, well, I'm just closing my laptop right now.
I feel like we can, like, we're both writers, we're both editors, right? Just like, between the two of us,
we should be able to justify them. I think that there's like a few different reasons. I think that one thing that editors are that I think is always important to remember as an editor is like the essential role is gatekeeping, and that's like really like hardcore to say as an opening line. And I think that that's both in like, I think with the internet and even with zines, you can sort of see like that's where people kind of put themselves out there, but there's such a wide array of content in the world that it's kind of hard to know where do you go and how do you find more, or how do you reach other audiences kind of things, how do you connect to other community, I guess. And so I think editor, it's a gatekeeper very much in the responsibility that term contains and in the power that term contains, but I think also in, I guess, more positive senses in terms of that I think it is an opening space for community that can occur in a publication. I think speaking as a writer, editors are really important for making you not look stupid. Like at a really basic level, there's like, you know, just spelling mistakes, or like, I don't know, when I was a kid, I wrote, and it's still online and it's really embarrassing, I wrote a review of the Mysterious Benedict Society for South Asians Women's Network newsletter.
Stop talking it down. Stop being embarrassed.
And I think that I used the word heroin and I misspelt it like the drug, and my mum had to be like, Adalya, it's the wrong one. But it's like those kinds of mistakes can happen to anyone, and I think that like basic levels of like spelling and facting and grammar, and I think that there are some places, I don't think all of those things have to be perfect. I don't think that that's like what shows that something is good or smart or like literature, but I think that at least knowing when you're breaking rules and how you're doing them is really important, to just have someone who can tap you on the shoulder and say like, just checking. I think it's also can be a really collaborative and like expanding process. I think that there's some work that I've edited and that I've had edited where barely anything has changed. But there are also lots of pieces and lots of writers who I love working with where I get a first draft and I think there's like lots of good stuff in here, but I'm not like, rah, rah, what a great piece of writing kind of thing. But then over the editorial process, it gets so much better than the pieces where maybe initially I was more thought they were of high quality because the writer is so responsive to points that I make. I think that as an editor, and this isn't necessarily how all editors view what they're doing, but I think that I work really hard as an editor to be like asking questions and seeing what the writer wants to do, and that there's very few places where I'm like, this is a hard no, or where this is a hard choice that you have to make kind of thing. It's all about like suggestions, and where I'll sort of say like, oh, I'll sort of question a sentence or say like, I think this needs to be clarified slightly. And where a writer will go away and it will rethink the whole essay and will sort of expand in this completely different way. And I think it's so amazing to see how work can change like that. And I think having that kind of collaborative relationship is just really important.
Yeah, I think that's like, well, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that everyone can have experiences like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really lovely way of looking at it. And I think also, I think sometimes as an emerging writer, the idea of an editor can be quite daunting, because it's somebody who is reading your work and they don't have to tell you that it's good. Like presumably if they've kind of commissioned it or they've accepted it for publication, they think there's some merit to it, right? But it's not like your mum or your partner or your best friend reading something and being like, yeah, it's really like really beautiful phrasing. Like they don't kind of have any skin in it beyond obviously liking it enough to want to help you put it out there in the world. But I think that's like I think that's also a really good thing for writers to keep in mind, is that they saw the editor sees something in it that makes them want to work with the piece and with you. And so when they're providing feedback or criticism or suggestions, or even just kind of circling things and saying, is this the best way of phrasing this? It's all done in this spirit of making a piece kind of, you know, the strongest and the cleanest and the most effective that it can be. it is difficult to, I think, as you know, when you're first going through that process, sometimes it's difficult to kind of tease out some of those instinctive personal reactions to things as a writer. You know, it's we had Holden Shepherd, or the author of Invisible Boys, oh my gosh, with us in our first live broadcast of this year, and we talked a little bit with him about that sort of instinctive defensive reaction that sometimes we have as writers, which is completely natural because and you sort of need to honor it and just like let yourself have it. But then learning when to turn that off as well, and trust in your editor's instinct and expertise and goodwill as well is really important.
Yeah, I think it's like I think you have to honor the instinct, and you also have to I think that there are two sides where I think one instinct can be, oh, they must be right about everything and I should follow it. And the other instinct can be like huge defensiveness and like this person's ruining me and ruining everything I've done. And I've definitely had both reactions as a writer myself. I think that as an editor, and again, I can't speak for all other editors in this, I think that some of these conversations are still really like new. I think that, I don't know, there's this very fancy editor in America who I heard give a talk where she was like, yeah, and so I saw this book and I email the writer and I say, this is what has to change, and then I'll make it a bestseller, and I do, kind of thing. And I don't think that that's what an editor's job is, and I think that there are a lot of ethical issues with thinking that that's what your job is, because I think that especially when you're editing stories about people who don't have the same experience as you, which is always, but you know, like when you're editing things that are quite far from your own experience, coming in and saying, okay, this is what needs to change to make this story good, and that not being a conversation is like really dangerous and terrible. And unfortunately still, I think, kind of common. That said, I think my editorial approach, I try really hard to work very hard to justify everything that I suggest and to make everything a question and to make everything a, like, what are other ways you could do this kind of thing. And so, and I think that that's really important, I guess, for people who want to be editors to start thinking about is, I think, both for writers and for editors, I think there's a huge sense that editing is something you do like red pen, like striking out, you know, flamboyantly going, this is trash or whatever. And I think that like it needs to be much more considered. Why is it trash? You know, like, you know, what's a way to make it not trash? Like, what are different pathways? And I think that yeah, that's something I try to be really conscious of, especially editing nonfiction. You're very often editing work that's really close to someone's personal experience. And as a writer, I've definitely had times where someone was making editorial suggestions and those suggestions weren't necessarily wrong. There was like, I think my first piece that was published, they like pulled out all of the adverbs where I'd been like, I beautifully did this and cleanly did this, and they like cut them all out without explaining it. And that was like really intense for me, where I was like, no, I'm being a baby, like I shouldn't care about this, but I care so much. And I think that there is something, we had Maria Tamarkin come in to VoiceWorks a couple of years ago to talk about ethical editing, and she sort of talked about how it can be quite re-traumatizing when something is really close to you to have your words changed, even if those changes don't matter, even if they're not actually denying the material reality of what you're describing, and they're just, you know, a comma or whatever, seeing your words changed when you struggled so hard to find them and to accept them in the first place is like a really traumatic experience.
And to also kind of live through the retelling, like if you are writing something that's kind of quite close to the bone, particularly if it's memoir or kind of approaches memoir, or even just draws on your own personal experience, to kind of, as you say, to find the right words, to find the language to describe that stuff is difficult enough. And then if you're, you know, if somebody is coming in even with, you know, good intentions, and kind of picking it apart, it is like it's very, very difficult to sit with.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that is good to know and to acknowledge when you're writing yourself and you have that experience. I think also, like as editors, we need to like be way more cognizant of that kind of thing. I think I work really hard to try and make all of my first edits that I don't do like track changes kind of stuff. I just make comments. Like I use track changes to leave comments everywhere. And I might make suggestions being like, kind of clunky, maybe rephrase, e.g. could be like this kind of thing. But I try really hard not to actually edit directly onto the paper until there's been like a bit more back and forth. There's a bit more trust in each other. And also I can kind of sense where the author's comfort lies. So I'm not kind of overstepping that hugely. And yeah, that's kind of how I see it as an editor and how I've seen it as a writer.
I think there has to be, like you used the word very early on before, you used the word collaborative in relation to your own process, which I think is a really like good and necessary way of looking at the editing process. And I think as you were talking, I was trying to kind of think about what adjective I might ascribe to the fancy editor who you mentioned. And it's, I don't know that this is the right word, but that seems like a much more interventionist mode of editing. And I guess it's not for me to say that's right or wrong, but it's about what sits with you most comfortably as a practitioner, as you know, as both an editor in your own right and as a writer. But I think there's a real danger in sort of that interventionist mode, for want of a better term, because I think when we go back to that idea of a collaborative process, the editing process is like a conversation between, two people. But if an editor is kind of just they might be making, sound structural changes or whatever, but if it's not consultative, to me, it starts to feel like it's less and less the author's work. Like if something isn't working, I would always try to encourage the author or the writer to find a better way of expressing it. Or I might say, this metaphor is a bit clunky, or I don't really understand how we got from this bit to this bit. Can you reframe this? But I think it's often best to let the writer work that out for themselves. Like they usually know the answer. Sometimes it's just a matter of having, the kind of problem area pointed out to you. And I say that as somebody who writes like at both ends of the spectrum. Sometimes as a writer, I just need somebody else to tell me this bit isn't working, and then I can fix it myself. And I think we become more confident in doing that as writers the more practice that we have.
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
troubleshooting our own work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think learning to edit both yourself and to work with an editor is like a process that takes time. That like I think definitely initially when I was writing things, I was writing very much top to bottom, and that's not how I write anymore. I maybe write too like fractally and sort of go like and then like cut and paste the stuff that isn't terrible and then kind of move it around. So maybe that's like too far in the other direction, but I think that you learn to see that stuff in your own work and to also respond to what people say about and to understand what people are trying to get at when they're saying that in your own work. But yeah, it's definitely I think there are places where I don't have necessarily a problem with interventionist editing, like, the car section. Maybe it's just because I don't have a big enough passion for like car retail or something. But I think I'm probably like, I don't feel like terribly hurt by the idea of like an editor of the car section kind of just changing things on the go and not really consulting the writer. I think that that's like very much I don't think the writer has that level of like probably a sense of ownership or investment in it in the same way.
I know, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
But like, when we're talking about fiction, memoir, poetry, I think it's important that there be some kind of conversation.
I think just anything where your name is actually on it. I think that lots of the times this is kind of writing where it's copy rather than, something that's attributed to you. So that makes a big difference.
So you, as we said before, you recently have started as an editor for VoiceWorks, which is very, very exciting. Do you have any tips for, like, okay, if you stick with your editor hat on here for a second, what does the ideal writer do when they've finished a piece before, like, what happens between them typing the last word and being like, oh, like, this is the best, and actually hitting submit and sending it to you?
I think that maybe the biggest thing is that they have read the publication that they're sending it to, which sounds like such a weird point, but I think that the most I'm like fine with typos and stuff, although I think there are points where it becomes unprofessional looking, or where I lose trust in a writer. But for the most part, I think the biggest thing that causes me to lose trust is a sense that the writer doesn't actually know what they're pitching to or what they're sending their work to. Not because I have some huge ego and want them to have subscribed. I don't need like a letter that like outlines every piece that you've loved, the pieces you think are not so good that we've published, and I don't need that kind of thing. It's not to stroke my ego or anything, but I think it's because you often see pieces, we get pieces that are pitched towards just a different publication to what we are, you know, pieces where I'm like, I think this is a good piece and I think it would sit great in the Saturday paper or the Junkie or those sorts of publications, and I don't have an issue with those publications, and that's not to say, like, you know, often that's like a thumbs up of like, what a good piece of writing, you know, like
keep going with it.
But it's not right for our publication, either because of schedule or just because of tone. Like, that's not our taste, is like, you know, that there's those kinds of like really, you know, I love Jono Revanche wrote a piece about Isabel from Animal Crossing as a queer icon that I love and go back to, but it's not necessarily what we would publish in VoiceWorks, because it's like a funny humour piece, and other work by Jono we would publish in VoiceWorks and have published in VoiceWorks. And so I think that
I'm sure I've seen their name in VoiceWorks.
Yeah, they used to edit for us. They're amazing. Like this isn't like, none of this is meant to be a like diss on that piece. I love it
forever, and everybody's going to see it. And Jono is going to come and tear our house. No, kidding. Sorry. It's a great piece. Everyone can read it.
But and they're a great writer. Like lots and lots of really good writing. But it's just not. There's pieces that we get where the tone isn't quite VoiceWorks tone, which isn't to say that we have like a specific you need to put on our hat either. It's just to say, like, often they're very much writing towards a different publication's tone, and it's like, I just don't think you know who we are. Like, I don't think you've read our stuff.
I think sometimes there's like this scattergun approach where somebody finishes a piece and, like, you know what that's like, you know, when you've put all of this time into a piece and you're so excited just to send it out into the world and to kind of go through that pitching process and to have it be over as well, because I don't find there to be anything particularly joyful about sending out work for submission. Like, that's my least favorite part of the whole gig. But also I think sometimes there are people who will kind of just go, okay, I'm going to make myself a list of 10 lit mags in Australia, or even just 20 publications in Australia. And like, there's no good submitting your article about, you know, how you really got into like horticulture to Archer, for instance, or like it kind of just shows this scattergun approach where you would be better off focusing your time and energy researching publications that fit whatever piece or story or poem that you've, like, that there will be a home for it, but you need to find that home rather than just like throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks kind of thing. It does a disservice both to the publication and the you know, the person who's reading your work, whether it's an editor or a submissions person, an intern. It also does a disservice to your work and kind of not reputation, but I guess it you know, it says something about how much effort you've put into looking or understanding what that publication does, I think.
Yeah, I think that in general a huge part of being a good writer is reading lots. Like, I think that I don't have a lot of time for people who are like, I just simply cannot read anything else because their voice will get too in my head. And I think, like, well, read a lot of things, and then all of the voices go in your head, and then they merge, and then you don't have to like worry about plagiarizing anyone. And I think that, like, more generally, that's this, you know, people should, and I don't want to put like some moral imperative on it, but I do think that you just become a better writer by knowing what people in your, like, you know, time period and, like, you know, community are writing and what they're writing about. Because again, we get pictures where it's like, this is an issue that I don't think is talked about enough, and that hasn't been talked about very much. And I think sometimes that I'm like, this is important, but it has actually been talked about a lot. Like, you know, that this is, you know, something like on gay marriage before it was legalized. That if we got a pitch being like, nobody's ever talked about gay marriage, it would be like, that's just not true. Like, there are lots and lots of pieces of writing about this, and that doesn't mean you can't write about it again in a new and like nuanced, complicated, personal way. But if you're saying nobody's ever written about this, then you're just telling me you haven't researched the thing that you want to write about. So
yes,
yeah, yeah, I think that that's probably my biggest like pet peeve thing that people should do before they submit.
I always think of a friend, somebody I know who runs a lit journal, and sorry, I'm just being really careful here. I don't know why I think I'm going to dox somebody like on a Wednesday night, you know. It's like not even a punishable offense really, but I always remember this friend saying that somebody, basically this publication had both a print and online edition, and then one of those editions ceased and the format changed. And they received this very like detailed pitch to the now defunct format. And it was like that particular format hadn't been produced for almost a year. And it was just kind of like this person had gone to all this trouble of saying in their cover letter, like, you know, how much they engage with the publication, they love it. But they didn't know, like they obviously didn't. And it was just kind of disingenuous. It was like, it's almost better not to lie about it than it is, you know, it's almost better just to be honest and be like, well, you know what, I was looking up Australian lit mags and I thought you guys looked cool, than it is to be like, oh, I really love this particular imprint that, you know, hasn't existed for a long time. And that has always really stuck with me. Like, just be honest. It's fine to learn about, it's good to learn about new publications and journals and to kind of, and to do your research. And I think it's also fine to be upfront about that and just to say, I came across, you know, I'd never heard of whatever it is, Overland, or I'd never heard of Liminal, and then I came across them. I would be really interested in interviewing this person, whatever. I think those pitches are fine because it shows possibly greater engagement than if you've lied about something. Like,
yeah, totally. I'm never angry with someone for not being a loyal reader since they were 13, or, you know, not learning to read on VoiceWorks. I didn't know about VoiceWorks. Like, I didn't, you know, that's not the issue. It's that, like, I want you to actually be, well, yeah, it does a disservice to your work because your work isn't suitable for my publication, and so I'm going to reject it. And then you're going to be like, oh no, this piece of writing is bad. And it's not bad. It's like, it might be good. It might be great. It just might not be.
But it might just be for, like, you know, Orthodontic Quarterly, or like,
yeah, totally,
Fishing and Tackling Summer Edition, whatever.
Yeah.
Fishing and Tackling, I don't know. So we have a Twitter question that I just saw.
Yeah.
What are some tips that you have for writers communicating concerns about edits or changes to editors? How can young writers, who are often just glad to be published, stand up for themselves?
I think this is a really complicated question and really dependent on the publication and on, like, whether the writer is relying on the money to pay rent. I think there's lots and lots and lots of questions. And, you know, also what influence that editor has. Like, I think that I would love to say, like, pull the piece or whatever, like, if they don't go, whatever. But that's like, well, not necessarily the first thing you should do. I mean, that's not step one. But also, but also doesn't necessarily, isn't necessarily always feasible because the money or the relationship might be too important. I think that as important as it is to communicate as an editor, it can also be really important as a writer to try and communicate that same level of respect. Even if that editor isn't showing you that, I think that it's good to at least start on that playing field of showing respect and saying, I see what you're saying here, but this is why I disagree. I think that there are times where I think it's good to sit with stuff, and I think it's good to sit and process things and not to reply in the heat of the moment while you're at your most upset, because I think it means that you can't always process exactly what it is that you're thinking about. I do think that, yeah, I guess I think that there is more power to push back than sometimes people feel. I think that there is space to say, look, I don't feel comfortable with this. And ultimately, writers have the power to pull their pieces. And I think that that's like, or, you know, usually do have the power to pull their pieces. And I think it's always good to bear in mind that that's possible, and that to, I guess, weigh up like where that's necessary or where you're okay with it. I think, you know, with adverbs, it made me feel upset, but ultimately I still believed in the publication. I was still glad to have my work featured there, and I still thought that it didn't wreck the integrity of my piece. Whereas if they're, you know, changing your opinion completely or whatever, or if you feel like you're being put on a chopping block, I think this happens especially in opinion publications. Often young writers,
I agree with you, yes.
Get put forward to put maybe a more extreme version of a nuanced conversation that needs to happen. You know, to say something that isn't necessarily even wrong, or isn't necessarily unheard of, you know, radicalism or whatever, but just to say something that's going to get clickbait and that's going to get engagement. Because ultimately, you know, especially those kind of online opinion publications, you know, like, yeah, again, not wanting to dox anybody, but I know that there are online opinion publications where the writer who is paid the most is not necessarily the one who is the most liked at the publication. It is not the reason people subscribe for that person's opinion, but it's because that writing gets the most like social media engagement, most of which is what absolute trash. And so I think that particular writer that I'm thinking of is not young and being taken advantage of. But I think that there are lots of situations where that is the case. And so I think where you feel like you're being essentially misportrayed, or where the thing that you're trying to put out there is being completely changed, I think that is a situation where you have to pull it. There's nothing else, that it's too much of a risk to your own reputation, I guess. And I think that you can do that in a not horrible way of just saying, like, look, I don't really feel comfortable about this. I don't want to put my name to this. I'm going to withdraw the piece. And some publications do have a kill fee. But I think that usually...
Sorry, could you explain what a kill fee is, just for anybody who might not know?
Yeah. So a kill fee is if a piece is commissioned, or if there's like a significant amount of editorial work done, but then the piece is not able to be published for completely boring reasons, like there's not enough space, or it's just like suddenly an incredibly inappropriate piece given the world situation or whatever. Thinking about I feel like that there was like a famous movie that Emma Stone was in where she was like a gangster, and then there was a scene in it where they like jumped out of a movie screen like firing guns, but then it was due to come out the week after the
I remember this
Batman movie theater shooting, so they had to completely reshoot the film and put it into a different like schedule, and it kind of made no sense anymore because that scene wasn't there. And you know, that's a really heavy example, but there are reasons why pieces you write might not be appropriate in the moment. You know, like how to be extremely sexually promiscuous. Probably like the week of COVID is like, oh, I'm going to pull this.
Yeah, so a kill fee would be like in those instances.
Yeah, they would pay
usually like a percentage of what they would have. It's not like the full amount, but it recognises that they have done. It was work. It was time and energy invested that ultimately didn't come to fruition.
Yes, Gangster Squad. That's the name of it.
Yes.
Yes. That's what it is.
Somebody else has asked a question. Adalya, very early on tonight, you talked about editors being gatekeepers. And this person has asked, can you explain or unpack that a little more?
Yeah, I think I'm constantly unpacking it. I don't think it's something that I can easily like justify or give a little TED talk on necessarily. I think it's something I'm constantly unpacking. But what a publication is, what a magazine is a collection of work that somebody has decided is good, and that somebody is an editor, and so I think that it's absolutely. I think it can be uncomfortable to see yourself, especially marginalized people who do face additional pressures, I guess, to acknowledge their own role as gatekeepers. And I think it's imperative. I think that all editors need to recognize that that's what their job is. I think it's an incredible responsibility that I'm really honored to have in terms of the ways that it allows me to invest time and energy into voices in communities that I think are underserved, and to challenge myself to work really hard and to be, a positive a positive person opening the gate for the right people. But it's a huge responsibility, and it can't be ignored that when we can all put something on the internet, when we can all make a zine, when we can all self-publish something. I mean, subject to finances, obviously, but these things aren't particularly difficult to do. What is the role of an editor, and the role of and what's the role of a publishing house? What's the role of a magazine? It's to say these are the good ones, which isn't to say that self-published stuff and zines. I make zines. I love zines. That's not to say that those are less legitimate and bad forms of media, but I think that they sit in a different place. It's a different distribution model. And
I think also that as a society, we also, sorry, I thought I just tipped over a vase of flowers. I think as a society, we do accord a different level of cultural capital to self-published books versus books published through conventional publishing houses. And
there's different cultural capital, and there's also different resources behind it that you can have a distributor rather than having to call every bookshop and convince them of the merit of your book. Exactly. And I think it's great that that those things exist. It's great that we're not all calling up every bookshop saying hey, I wrote a short story collection and I think it's pretty good. It's great that you have a publisher who will say, these are the ways to make your short story collection better, and we'll do the calling around of the bookstores kind of thing. That's it. It's really useful that exists, and that simply can't exist for and isn't the best model for everything. There are lots of cool forums for publication that aren't that kind of standard thing, and I'm really interested in that. And I don't want to say that that's what editors are, to discredit those forms of expression and those forms of writing community that exist. Zine fairs are incredible. I love going to zine fairs and telling people to submit to VoiceWorks, but also just I have a huge collection and I make them myself. But when that's there, why do people want to be published in magazines versus doing that? Or why do people buy magazines when they can just buy zines? And it's because someone is saying this is worth your time. And I try and make sure that the things I tell people are worth their time really are, and aren't just the same piece of writing and same perspective as they would maybe otherwise see.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point as well, because I mean, there's like there is a huge kind of homogeneity in Australian publishing, and sorry, not specifically Australian. I guess that's what I'm most familiar with, but it's not to say it's not a problem elsewhere as well. And it's this like model that's overwhelmingly dominated by white women at the kind of lower to middle levels, and then senior management is white men. And so that it just like it what that creates in terms of the gatekeepers is this huge, the same homogeneity of voices potentially. And so it's really important, like when you're talking about editors or commissioning editors or whoever, whoever's reading the submissions, whether it's a publishing house or a lit journal or whatever else, it's really important that the person doing the gatekeeping, that all of those people are not exactly the same, because it's kind of like that funnel mentality where there's, we've seen in Australian publishing over the last 100 years this great propensity to sort of self-select exactly the same stories because we recognise them and we're comfortable with them, at the expense of other voices and stories and narratives. And so I can appreciate, like, I've never been in a commissioning editor role, but I can absolutely imagine what a responsibility and kind of, I don't know, like a privilege as well to get to sit with those decisions.
Yeah, well, even at the level of deciding what version of something is publishable or not is making those kinds of decisions again. And I think that's
Totally.
Yeah, I think even at a I am a very political person, and I take that aspect of my work very seriously, and that's a huge part of what I care about and what I came into the VoiceWorks role to do. I think even aside from that, though, like what I really value about working with VoiceWorks and what's so different about it, that it is essentially so unique, is that there are so many people in the room at all times, because so much of it is volunteer, and because we sort of have so many people and are lucky to have people who are all really different in terms of perspective, in terms of identity, and but also just in terms of like who grew up in Canberra, who's studying medicine, who's doing this kind of stuff. And I think that that's like a really if I was the sole arbiter of VoiceWorks, try as I might, I would probably like really like select towards experimental poetic essays, with lots of weird things happening and pulling from pop culture and doing all of this kind of stuff. I love that. That's not to say that's not to downplay the strength of my taste, but that's what when I'm reading, I can see those pieces getting to a final place really easily. I can see what is going to happen. Whereas there's another editor who is much more typically drawn to those kinds of, in some senses, more like conventional, I guess, but much more research-based and sometimes more, I guess, less memoir-y kind of essays of that using lots and lots of research, I guess, really, and are really taking that kind of a perspective. And sometimes the stuff that she's really excited about is not the stuff that I'm initially that excited about. But then by the time the magazine is finished, I'm like, oh, this is great. And it's because she could just see a vision for that piece in a way that I couldn't. And I think that we, in lots of ways, very similar. We're both like queer Asians that grew up in Canberra. Like, there's a lot of parts of our perspective that would be very similar, but who play classical music. We have a lot who went to the same science camp in Year 12. We have a lot in common. But we have this really different way of seeing of what we see when we first are looking at something. And
exactly. And that's just like, part of that is just preference and taste, right? And so that's kind of like a really great example of how two people on paper who are like notionally similar, like, if we were kind of to do the census on you two, Like, oh, they went to the same science camp. They both play violin. Like, they both grew up in Canberra. And you can still have such, like, there's still this plurality of opinion and of this diversity in, like, what gets you excited as an editor and as a reader.
And I think that, we do see, because it's a lot of white middle-aged women in publishing and who are also, you know, going to festivals, who are the primary audience that publishers see as who they're looking at and who is going to come to their stuff. The work is targeted towards selling books that they will buy. And obviously there's a plurality within that, as there is a plurality with me and Sana, but it is still so much narrower because...
Yes, I was going to say, it's a lot.
Yeah.
Just one more Twitter question. We might be able to fit two in. I don't know. We'll see how we go for time. This is a good question, actually. How do you get yourself out of a post-rejection funk? And is putting your work in a drawer an important step?
I'm not like taking a long time to think about this because I'm like, I wouldn't know.
I've never been rejected.
I've never been rejected. I think sitting on work can be really important. I don't know if that's necessarily particular to a post-rejection funk, but I think that there can just be like a lot of the work that I'm writing at the moment, I'm not writing with the expectation that it's going to be published in the next 12 months. I'm not writing it just for myself. I'm writing it because I want it to be something, but it's very close to home and I want it to be like exactly right. And I want to know that the place that I'm taking it to be published is somewhere I can really trust to edit and to understand, and to even at a marketing level, there's elements that could go in a really distressing direction, and that I wouldn't want to do that. So I think putting your work in a drawer can be really important, just as a general thing for knowing when you're ready for it to be out there, when you know you're just going to need more time until you feel like it's right, and also just knowing that you have a place that you feel good about it. But I think in terms of more generally a post-rejection funk, I think I don't know what I normally do. I think I just feel sad, and then I apply for other things until something goes well, and then I feel a bit less sad. I think that I don't go for the technique of getting straight back on the horse and sending it out to more places, unless it's something that I feel confident in, and I think like, oh yeah, it's a good essay and it's just been rejected from this magazine because
they just ran a piece like it last week or whatever.
Yeah, it's not the right, they already have a lot of pieces and they're not looking for something topical right now or something like that. And in that case, like, I think there are lots of cases where a rejection is not because the work is bad, but because it's just not going to fit or whatever. But I think, well, especially when you get, I guess sometimes it's more, I get in more of a funk when like fellowships or something, where I apply for like a, to be this person's writer in residence or whatever, where it's like they're not judging any piece of work in particular that you can send out, they're judging you. I find that to be more of a hit to my ego, I think, because I can't just be like, oh, well, I guess that was a trash essay. Oh, well, I guess they were full. I'm like, well, even though it is the case that just like there's so many great applicants that I just wasn't the best one, I sometimes do go like, oh, I'm essentially bad at what I'm doing, or like I overanalyze who did better, and I'm like, what did they do that's better than me?
It feels much more personal.
Yeah. But I think it helps to know the numbers, having, being on the other side of selecting people. At the moment, I'm, looking at bringing in on a few new people for the VoiceWorks editorial committee, and it's always the case that, at least 2/3 of the people who apply would be, I'm sure, excellent. Like, like a very qualified, which they don't have to be, you know, like VoiceWorks is a learning opportunity. You don't have to have a master's to go to VoiceWorks. But part of the point is that it can be an education. I joined VoiceWorks, I was doing a science degree. But, you know, it's always the case that so many of those applications are so strong, and you're just splitting hairs to try and work out, you know, which is a very lucky decision for me to be in, looking through all these great applicants and thinking like, you know, I have the pick of the bunch, you know, kind of thing. But it's also really, you know, like, sucks that
you don't see that on the receiving end of it. You just get the rejection. I mean, it might be a really nice rejection email, but usually you just get like, you know, usually it's just like, sorry, we can't accept this piece, or sorry, you missed out, or sorry, like you know, your application was shortlisted, but it didn't quite make the grade for whatever reason. And usually you don't get told, you know, you might get a very kind of cursory explanation, but usually you don't get more than that. And so I think it can be really tough to be on the other side when you're kind of guessing, you know, you're like, was it that my application was bad? And often there's nothing wrong with your application. It's just, you know, as you say, it's like a numbers game.
I think, with VoiceWorks, we're really lucky, and I'm really glad to provide feedback on all submissions.
Yeah, that's actually a really good, a good thing to mention.
So VoiceWorks publishes writers under 25 in Australia, and we provide feedback on all pieces that aren't accepted. And it takes us a while, especially at the moment. We all of our cover sheets were locked in the office for a long time, so we just couldn't access them. We do try and provide feedback. And so in a case where you do have feedback, I think again, you might need to sit. You might need to read it and then go and sit with it and go like, okay, and then decide what works for you. Because even when I'm writing feedback, you know, the writer always does know the piece better than the editor. And that doesn't mean that the writer is never wrong, but there are just, you know, sometimes there are potential directions that might be there that the editor can't see that you can. And so I think, you know, sitting with it and working out where they've understood where you were going and where they've, you know, maybe given a piece of advice that could be right for one writer but isn't right for you. I think that's important. And I think even when I'm writing feedback, I always try and be cognizant of like giving different directions so that people can see multiple places and find one that feels close to them. But I think when you have feedback, I think sometimes when you first get it, it can be really overwhelming, and you just have to sit with it and then go back to it after a week or two. I don't know. Yeah, I guess that's my advice.
I think also like, I don't know, I always feel a bit weird giving this advice because I'm aware of how pessimistic it sounds. That's my disclaimer. I don't mean it in a pessimistic way. I think I'm really good at like compartmentalizing. Maybe that's a trick. Just do a lot of therapy and you'll be able to like work through it. No worries. No, what I was going to say is like when you, I think it's good to go into this industry with really low expectations. And I don't necessarily mean being like cap in hand and never questioning anything or never pushing back against anything. That's not what I mean at all. But in terms of, you know, things like publication opportunities or fellowships or grants, unfortunately in Australia, like it's a very, very, very small ecosystem. There are very, very few opportunities. And there are a lot of very talented people, which is wonderful. But it's a crowded little pond. And so it's good to know that and to kind of not have any, I don't know, like I think when I submit stuff, and I send a lot of stuff, I apply for a bunch of stuff, like I'll fire it out, but then I almost forget about it. Like I've trained myself to almost forget about stuff. Because I don't want my level of investment to be too high. As I'm saying this, again, I know how pessimistic it sounds, but you just have to kind of like know the numbers and know your chances. And I truly think that helps with the disappointment a little bit, because if you go into it with this kind of like realistic attitude of this piece is the best that I can make it right now without any further kind of editorial assistance or support, I think it's, I've done the best I can with it. I'm ready to send it out. You've spoken tonight about like the million reasons that something might be rejected that have nothing to do with your writing whatsoever. Timing is a big one that I think we don't talk about enough, or the fact that, they just don't have space for it in their magazine or whatever it is. They published something really similar last month and they don't want to do it again. But I also think there will be times when, you don't receive feedback, or you don't agree with the feedback, or you see the feedback and you think, oh, I don't know how to implement it by myself. Like, I need support to do this. And that's okay. And it's okay to lick your wounds. But I think not so much in the sense of getting back on the horse, but I think it's just good to approach it as like a job, and it's this constant apprenticeship. It's just, you keep working at it forever, and there's never going to be a point where, or I haven't reached that point yet, I don't know anybody who has, where you get everything that you apply for or every single pitch lands. That's just like, rejection is a part of the job. And again, I don't say this to be like a Debbie Downer, but just it's kind of like almost part of your job description is being able to sit with that and being comfortable with it. Learning how to do that is another thing, but like, have interests, I think your suggestion about reading other people's work is a really good one. Like, you can take solace in things that are not your writing and lick your wounds a little bit and then go back to it when you're ready.
Yeah. I think that actually a lot of my skills in handling rejection came from like unemployment and just like applying for so many jobs that just 100%.
Oh my God, same.
100% I would be fine at, 100% I was overqualified for, and just getting so many rejections, not even interviews kind of things. And I think then one of my partner's friends works at seek.com, and I was like, what are your tips? I just am trying to do admin work. I have like, I'm really like competent, and just like nothing's happening. And he's like, yeah, so like our stats show that like the highest like indicator of whether or not you get an admin job is if you're in like the first 10 applications. Like, it's just like a, and so that like changed the way I applied for admin jobs. Was like, okay, well, if it's been up for more than an hour, I'm not applying. And that's like and that stopped me imagining myself in those roles. They're like, as silly as it sounds to be like, oh, I would just imagine myself doing admin for a radiology clinic, and it's like, that's not, anything to do with what I want to do. But it's really easy, with these amazing fellowships as well, but even just with like really humble, work where you're just really desperate and you're just trying to say like, yes, I can see myself doing this. And it's really easy to imagine yourself there. And I think it's good to, turn it off as much as possible.
I think, exactly. I had exactly the same experience. There was like this couple of month period where I applied for like 50 or 60 jobs in quick succession, and they were all things that I could do. Like, some of them were like professional roles, and other ones were like being an attendant in the, like a, what are they called? Like a working in a museum gift shop, or like real estate copywriting, which like anybody who's seen a real estate billboard knows exactly the standard of that writing. And like, I had a book published at this time. It wasn't that like I had no runs on the board, like, not that I thought a novel was going to help me get a copywriting job, whatever. But I think that was kind of a good lesson in, and I actually do think you can apply this for writing. I think the very first few times you send out a pitch, you have so much writing on it because it feels like this really big, it's this big event. It's the first time you've done it, and it's like, diving into the deep end. But then the more you do it, the more it kind of, it becomes less of a big event that you're pinning everything on. And so exactly like you were talking about applying for jobs, like, I used to think applying for jobs was like this it is a time consuming process, but it used to be like a week-long thing. And when I really needed a job, and I was just like applying left, right, and center, I was just like, key selection criteria, baby, here we go. An hour, I bet I can do it. Like, and I think writing is exactly the same. The more comfortable you get with pitching and with being rejected, and just you sit with it for a second, and then you go, okay, on to the next thing. The more it's like anything else, you build up that kind of like stamina for rejection almost. And I genuinely think that helps.
Yeah, definitely. Practice makes perfect.
It does. We are running out of time for this evening. Thank you, Adalya, for joining us so much. And thank
having
you, thank you, audience, for being along on this ride this evening. I hope everyone stays safe, stays well, and if you are interested, please apply for the upcoming Toolkits programs we spoke about earlier. There's some really exciting stuff happening there. And submit to VoiceWorks so Adalya can read your work and other people's. See you later, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.